Silence, in the context of a narcissistic dynamic, is not just the absence of words. It is the withdrawal of psychological supply. And to truly understand what happens when you never reach out again, we have to understand what supply actually means in the internal world of a narcissist. Narcissistic supply is not simply admiration. It is any form of attention that confirms their existence, importance, and impact. Praise feeds it, desire feeds it, fear feeds it, even your anger feeds it. When you argue, when you defend yourself, when you send long emotional messages trying to explain your hurt, you are engaging. You are responding. And that response reinforces their central psychological need: to feel significant and in control. For someone with strong narcissistic traits, relationships are not mutual emotional exchanges. They are regulatory systems. They use other people to stabilize their fragile self-esteem. If they feel insecure, they provoke reassurance. If they feel bored, they create drama. If they feel ignored, they escalate. Your reactions become the emotional barometer that tells them they still matter. Now imagine what happens when that stops. When you never reach out again, no birthday message, no late night, just thinking about you, no social media likes, no checking in during a crisis. You remove the feedback loop. You interrupt the system they rely on to regulate themselves. At first, they may not notice, or they may assume you are waiting. They often believe silence is temporary because the cycle has always brought you back before. But as time passes, the absence becomes louder. Silence forces them into a space where there is no reflection, no emotional mirror, no confirmation that they are still influencing you. And for someone dependent on external validation, that absence creates psychological discomfort. It produces anxiety. It creates a subtle but persistent question. Why haven't they reached out? That question is destabilizing because narcissistic personalities often operate under an assumption of indispensability. They believe they are unforgettable. They believe their impact lingers indefinitely. When you disappear without explanation, without drama, without pleading, you contradict that belief. And that contradiction feels like rejection. The withdrawal of supply activates something known as narcissistic injury. This is not ordinary hurt. It is a deep wound to their self-concept. Their identity is constructed around being desired, feared, admired, or needed. When you no longer participate in that construction, they lose a piece of scaffolding holding up their self-image. Some will respond with indifference on the surface. They may act as if they do not care. They may quickly display a new relationship, a new success, a new source of admiration. But this behavior is often compensatory. It is a rapid search for replacement supply. The goal is not emotional intimacy, it is emotional stabilization. Because when you withdraw, they experience something profoundly uncomfortable: emptiness. Many narcissistic individuals struggle with an internal void, a sense of not being enough that they cannot consciously face. Supply distracts from that void. It covers it. It keeps it quiet. When you stop reaching out, you are no longer helping them avoid that inner silence. And inner silence is frightening for someone who has built their identity around external noise. Your silence also disrupts predictability. Narcissistic dynamics thrive on cycles: idealization, devaluation, discard, and hoover. Each phase keeps the emotional system engaged. When you remove yourself entirely, you step off the cycle. There is no argument to win, no emotional hook to pull, no dramatic closure scene. You simply vanish from the game. And when someone is used to controlling the game, The sudden lack of participation feels like loss of authority. They may attempt to provoke you indirectly, posting things meant to trigger you, reaching out through mutual contacts, creating situations that require your response. These are attempts to restore the flow of supply. But if you remain silent, something profound happens. The power dynamic shifts. Silence communicates something words never could. I no longer need this interaction. And need is the currency of narcissistic relationships. The person who appears less attached often holds more perceived power. When you demonstrate detachment through consistent silence, you redefine the balance. This is why silence is so psychologically potent. It is not aggressive. It is not confrontational. It does not give them material to twist or weaponize. It is clean. It is controlled. It is final. And that finality forces realization. They realize they cannot access you at will. They realize their charm does not automatically reopen doors. They realize that their past influence has limits. And perhaps most unsettling of all, they realize you may be moving forward without them. The withdrawal of supply is not about punishing them. It is about reclaiming your emotional energy. Every time you resist reaching out, you are strengthening your own self-regulation instead of reinforcing theirs. You are redirecting attention inward rather than outward. In that redirection lies transformation, because while they are confronted with the discomfort of lost validation, you are learning to exist without the need for their acknowledgement. You are breaking the dependency loop. You are proving to yourself that silence does not equal weakness. It equals autonomy. And autonomy is something no narcissist can take from you once you decide to keep it. When you never reach out again, one of the most destabilizing realizations for a narcissist is not simply that you are gone. It is that they are no longer in control of the narrative. Control for a narcissistic personality is not just about telling you what to do. It is about controlling how they are perceived, how the relationship is defined, and ultimately how the story ends. In most narcissistic dynamics, they are the ones who decide when the connection intensifies and when it withdraws. They decide when to respond warmly and when to go cold. They decide when to give attention and when to withhold it. This push and pull dynamic keeps you emotionally invested and slightly off balance. It reinforces their position of power. But when you stop reaching out entirely, something unprecedented happens. The script is no longer in their hands. Narcissistic individuals often operate from a deeply ingrained belief that they are the chooser, not the chosen. They discard, they detach, they move on. Even when they appear to be the one left behind, they psychologically reframe it as their decision. This reframing protects their ego. It maintains the illusion of superiority. However, when you disengage quietly and consistently, without dramatic exits, without begging, without final emotional speeches, you deny them the opportunity to frame the ending on their terms. They cannot say they discarded you if you walked away first. They cannot claim they were done if you simply stopped participating. This creates a profound identity threat. At the core of narcissism lies a fragile sense of self. The grandiosity, the confidence, the superiority. These are compensatory structures. Beneath them often sits insecurity and fear of insignificance. Control over relationships acts as reinforcement. It tells them they matter. It tells them they have impact. Control is also about predictability. Narcissistic personalities are often highly attuned to patterns. They learn your emotional triggers. They know how long it takes before you reach out. They understand which words will provoke guilt, which gestures will provoke hope. This knowledge gives them strategic advantage. Your silence disrupts that predictability. Suddenly, they cannot anticipate your behavior. They do not know if you are thinking about them. They do not know if you are anger, yes, or indifferent. They do not know if you are struggling or thriving. The absence of data becomes unsettling. For someone who thrives on reading and manipulating emotional cues, not knowing feels like vulnerability. And vulnerability is something they avoid at all costs. When they cannot access you, they begin to experience what feels like loss of dominance. Even if they quickly attach to someone new, the unresolved gap you leave behind lingers in the background. It becomes an unanswered question in their psyche. Why didn't they come back? That question chips away at the illusion of absolute influence. In many cases, this loss of control triggers attempts to regain it. They may send subtle messages designed to test the door, a neutral greeting, a shared memory, a seemingly harmless question. These are probes. They are not necessarily expressions of longing. They are attempts to reestablish leverage. If you respond, even briefly, the control loop begins to reactivate. The system re-engages. They feel reassured, I can still reach them. But if you do not respond, the psychological tension intensifies. The lack of control can feel humiliating to a narcissistic personality. Humiliation is particularly intolerable because it exposes the discrepancy between their self-image and reality. They see themselves as powerful, desired, central. Being unable to access you contradicts that identity. To protect themselves, they may reconstruct the narrative. They may convince themselves that you are immature, that you are playing games, that you are not worth pursuing. This cognitive reframing is a defense mechanism. It restores their internal sense of superiority, yet beneath that narrative often lies frustration. Because your silence does something subtle but profound. It shifts the locus of power back to you. Power in relationships is not about who speaks the loudest. It is about who is less dependent on the outcome when you no longer need their validation, their response, or their closure. You demonstrate independence, and independence removes leverage. This is why silence can feel so threatening to someone who relies on dominance. It communicates that their approval is no longer currency. It signals that your emotional world is no longer organized around them. And that realization can create a temporary identity destabilization. If they are not the central figure in your story, who are they? If they cannot provoke you, charm you, or anger you, what does that say about their influence? In the absence of control, they are forced, however briefly, to confront themselves without the buffer of manipulation. Some may immediately seek new sources of control to avoid this discomfort. Others may oscillate between anger and nostalgia. But internally, the realization remains. They cannot dictate your behavior anymore. Meanwhile, something powerful is happening on your side. When you stop reaching out, you begin reclaiming personal agency. You are no longer reacting to their timing, their moods, their attention cycles. Your emotional rhythm becomes self-directed. This self-direction is the foundation of healing. Because the ultimate shift is not just that they lose control, it is that you regain it. And once you experience what it feels like to operate from self-control, rather than emotional reactivity, the dynamic fundamentally changes. Their influence diminishes not because they vanish, but because your dependency does. Control thrives where there is attachment without boundaries. Silence introduces boundaries without confrontation. It is calm, steady, and unwavering. And that steadiness is something no narcissistic strategy can easily penetrate. When you never reach out again, and the silence stretches longer than they anticipate, something deeper begins to unfold inside the narcissistic psyche: ego injury. This is not ordinary disappointment. It is not the simple sting of being ignored. It is a profound threat to the identity structure they have worked so hard to construct. At the core of narcissism lies a carefully engineered self-image. It is polished, inflated, and defended at all costs. They see themselves as exceptional, unforgettable, desirable, superior. Even when they appear insecure, that insecurity is often masked by defensiveness or grandiosity. Their internal narrative depends on one fundamental belief: I matter more. Your silence quietly challenges that belief. When you stop reaching out, you are no longer reinforcing their importance. You are no longer confirming that they occupy your thoughts. You are no longer proving that they have emotional impact. And when that confirmation disappears, the ego does not simply feel bruised, it feels exposed. Ego injury occurs when reality contradicts the narcissist's self-perception. If they believe they are irresistible, your absence contradicts that. If they believe no one truly leaves them, your consistency proves otherwise. If they assume you are still emotionally attached, your detachment destabilizes that assumption. This contradiction creates internal tension. And because narcissistic personalities struggle with emotional regulation, this tension often transforms into narcissistic rage. Rage is not always explosive. It can be loud and aggressive, angry messages, insults, public attacks. But it can also be subtle and strategic sarcasm, passive-aggressive comments, calculated indifference. The purpose of rage is not just to hurt you. It is to restore the ego. Anger can temporarily reestablish a sense of power. If they can provoke you, they regain control. If they can upset you, they feel impactful again. If they can rewrite the narrative and portray themselves as the victim, they repair the wound to their pride. But if you remain silent, the rage has nowhere to land. That is what makes silence so psychologically destabilizing. It does not provide resistance. It does not provide emotional fuel. It leaves their projections suspended in mid-air. Underneath the rage is often shame. Shame is the emotion narcissistic defenses are built to avoid. It is the unbearable feeling of not being enough, not being chosen, not being significant. When you disengage without drama, you do not give them an obvious villain role to assign to you. No betrayal they can clearly weaponize. There is simply your absence. There is simply your absence. And absence can feel like quiet rejection. Rejection pierces the grandiose shell. It whispers a possibility they cannot tolerate. Maybe I was not as important as I thought. Rather than consciously process that thought, they may double down on superiority. They may flaunt achievements, showcase new relationships, amplify their successes publicly. These behaviors are ego repairs. The louder the display, often the deeper the injury. Narcissistic rage can also manifest internally. They may obsess over why you have not returned. They may replay interactions in their mind, searching for the moment they lost control. They may alternate between blaming you and resenting themselves, though self-blame is usually fleeting and quickly redirected outward, because sustained accountability would require confronting vulnerability. And vulnerability feels like annihilation to a fragile ego. What is important to understand is that your silence removes the distraction that once protected them from facing their own emotional fragility. When you were engaged, arguing, explaining, defending, the focus stayed on the conflict. Now the focus turns inward. That inward focus can feel threatening. Some narcissistic individuals will respond by escalating attempts to provoke you. They may try to trigger jealousy. They may spread rumors. They may attempt to damage your reputation. These are not random acts. They are efforts to convert ego injury into restored dominance. If they can make you react, they can soothe the wound. But if you remain steady, something profound happens. The ego injury does not get externally patched. It lingers. And while many narcissistic personalities will quickly seek new supply to mask that discomfort, the imprint of your silence remains. It becomes divide. Recognize that someone was capable of walking away without collapse. And that evidence is difficult to erase. Meanwhile, on your side, something entirely different is happening. While their ego may be inflamed, yours is stabilizing. Silence protects your nervous system from the volatility of rage. It prevents you from being pulled into emotional battles designed to distract from their insecurity. You are no longer participating in the cycle of injury and retaliation. Instead, you are choosing emotional neutrality. And neutrality is powerful because it communicates that you are no longer emotionally available for ego games. You are not there to absorb their anger. You are not there to repair their shame. You are not there to validate their superiority. You are simply absent. For someone whose identity relies on being central in your emotional life, that absence feels like a wound. But for you, it is the beginning of detachment. Ego injury and narcissistic rage may flare in response to your silence. But if you hold your ground, that storm eventually loses intensity, because storms require friction and silence offers none. And in that stillness, you reclaim something they never truly wanted you to have: emotional sovereignty. When you never reach out again and your silence remains consistent, something even more unsettling begins to occur within the narcissistic psyche: the slow collapse of the illusion of superiority. Narcissism is sustained by a carefully maintained hierarchy. In that hierarchy, they are elevated. They are smarter, more desirable, more emotionally intelligent, more powerful. Even when they appear humble, the internal framework often places them above others. That illusion requires reinforcement. It requires people who chase them, people who seek their approval, people who feel lucky to be chosen. In many narcissistic dynamics, part of the unspoken contract is this: you will continue to orbit them emotionally. You will continue to show that their presence in your life matters more than your absence in theirs. When you stop reaching out, that orbit shifts. You are no longer revolving around them. And without that gravitational pull, their perceived centrality begins to wobble. The illusion of superiority is not sustained internally. It is sustained relationally. It depends on comparison and contrast. If you appear hurt, they feel powerful. If you appear confused, they feel clear. If you appear longing, they feel desired. But if you appear indifferent, or worse, peaceful, that comparison no longer elevates them. Silence creates ambiguity. They do not know whether you are thriving or struggling. They do not know whether you think about them or barely remember them. And in that uncertainty, the automatic assumption of superiority weakens, because superiority relies on visibility. If they cannot see your pain, they cannot confirm their dominance. If they cannot see your attempts to reconnect, they cannot confirm their desirability. Your silence removes the data they use to rank themselves above you. At first, they may compensate by amplifying their image. Social media becomes a stage. Achievements become louder. New relationships become highly visible. They curate a narrative of success and happiness. This is not random. It is strategic self-reinforcement. They are attempting to reassure themselves and potentially you that they are still winning. But here is the psychological tension. If they were completely secure in that superiority, they would not need to prove it. The performance itself often reveals the crack in the illusion. Because when someone truly feels superior, they do not obsess over being seen that way. Your silence plants a subtle but persistent doubt. If I am so exceptional, why didn't they keep on back? That question may not be consciously articulated, but it echoes internally. It challenges the assumption that everyone inevitably returns. Narcissistic dynamics often rely on a history of people tolerating behavior, forgiving quickly, or re-engaging despite mistreatment. That pattern reinforces the belief that they are indispensable. When you break that pattern, you introduce cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is the mental discomfort experienced when beliefs conflict with reality. They may believe they are irresistible. Your continued absence suggests otherwise. To reduce that discomfort, they must either change the belief or reinterpret the situation. Most often, they reinterpret. They may decide you are too damaged to appreciate them. They may label you as emotionally weak, jealous, or incapable. These reinterpretations serve one purpose: to preserve the illusion of superiority. It is easier to downgrade you than to question themselves. But even with that mental restructuring, the seed of doubt remains. Because superiority feels strongest when it is reflected back by others. Without your reflection, the image becomes less vivid. It is like standing in a room full of mirrors and suddenly removing one. The overall reflection changes. Over time, if silence persists, some narcissistic individuals begin to feel something unfamiliar, insignificance. Not necessarily in a dramatic, conscious way, but in a subtle erosion of certainty. You are no longer validating their specialness. You are no longer reinforcing the idea that they are unforgettable is one of the most threatening possibilities to a narcissistic ego. This does not mean they will admit it. They may outwardly project confidence and indifference. They may appear completely unaffected, but internally, the absence of reinforcement alters the equilibrium. Meanwhile, something equally important is happening for you. As the illusion of their superiority fades, you begin to see them more clearly. Distance reduces distortion. When you are not emotionally entangled, their grandiosity appears less impressive. Their charm appears more calculated. Their confidence appears more fragile. Silence creates perspective, and perspective dismantles the pedestal. The collapse of the illusion is not explosive. It is gradual, it is quiet. It is the slow realization that they are not as omnipotent as they once seemed, that they cannot control every narrative, that they cannot guarantee every return. Your silence becomes evidence that their influence has limits. And when someone who relies on superiority confronts limitation, it forces an uncomfortable recalibration. They may quickly seek new environments where they feel elevated again. They may surround themselves with people who admire them unquestioningly. But the fact remains, someone walked away and did not look back. That reality punctures the myth of inevitability. And in puncturing that myth, your silence does something profound. It restores balance. It reminds both of you in different ways that no one is above consequence. No one is above being left their illusion weakens, your clarity strengthens, and in that shift, the hierarchy dissolves.